There were 2 cups on the table every morning, one for the woman who still lived in the house on Clover Street, and one for the man who no longer did. And if you had looked through the kitchen window at just the right moment, you might have thought you were seeing something broken. But you would have been wrong. You would have been seeing something held together by a single quiet act of love, the kind that asks nothing in return except the chance to continue. Welcome to the Lamplit Hour, where every story is a small light left on for someone who needs it. If stories like this bring you comfort, take a moment to subscribe and stay a while. Beatrice Calloway had lived on Clover Street for 39 years. She and Sam had moved into the house in the spring of 1987, when the red maple in the front yard was barely taller than Sam's shoulder, and the kitchen still had that particular smell of old wallpaper paste and someone else's cooking. They had painted every room themselves, Sam in his weekend flannel shirts, Bea in the oversized denim apron she still kept on the hook by the back door, the one with a sunflower stitched on the pocket that had faded from bright yellow to the color of old cream. They had raised their daughter, Louise, in those rooms. They had weathered 2 roof repairs, 1 flooded basement, a series of bad winters, and the long, slow tenderness that comes from knowing exactly how another person takes their morning tea. Sam liked his with a splash of milk and 1 sugar, stirred 3 times clockwise, a habit so fixed that Bea had never once asked him, in 34 years of marriage, how he wanted it. She simply knew, and she made it that way. Sam had been gone for 6 years now, 6 years, and yet every morning, without ceremony, without thinking much about it at all, or perhaps thinking about it more than she could say, Bea still set 2 cups on the table. She rose each morning at 6:30. This was a habit that had survived everything, including grief, including the first year when getting out of bed at all had felt like an act of enormous will. Her body had its rhythms, and her body had kept them, even when her heart had not known what to do with itself. She put on a robe, the blue one, a little frayed at the cuffs now, and she padded in her slippers to the kitchen, and she filled the kettle, and she set it on the stove. She had 2 mugs she used every morning. One was hers, a wide cream-colored mug with a chip on the handle she'd been meaning to replace for 2 years and hadn't. The other was Sam's, plain white with a small blue stripe near the rim, the sort of mug you could find in any diner in America. Purchased at a yard sale decades ago for 25 cents, and somehow outlasting nearly everything else. Bea set them both on the table across from each other, the way they had always sat, Sam on the side nearest the window. She poured hot water over the tea bags, 2 cups, and let them steep. She cut herself a piece of toast. She sat in her chair, the chair closest to the stove where it was warmest, and she wrapped both hands around her own mug, and she looked across at Sam's. She did not speak to the cup. That was not what this was. She simply let it be there, full and steaming across the table. A place kept. A seat that was not empty, not exactly, because something warm still occupied it. Something she could not name precisely, but would not give up. She drank her tea, she ate her toast, and when she was finished, she poured Sam's cup down the drain, rinsed it, and set it on the rack to dry. Then she got dressed and got on with the day. Louise had noticed the first time she came to visit after Sam passed. She had stood in the kitchen doorway in the early morning, half awake, watching her mother set out 2 cups, and she had felt the particular grief of a child watching a parent grieve. She had not said anything. She was wise enough, or perhaps only tired enough, to understand that some things do not benefit from being named. Bea's sister, Ruth, had visited the following summer and had been less circumspect. Bea, she had said, gently, but with the directness of someone who has known you your entire life. That 2nd cup. I know, Bea had said. I know what it looks like. Does it help? Bea had considered this for a long moment, looking at the 2 cups sitting on the table, one in front of her, one in front of the empty chair. It helps me remember that mornings are still worth having, she said, and Ruth had nodded and poured herself a cup of coffee and said nothing more about it. The neighbors on Clover Street were the way neighbors in small American towns often are, aware of one another without being intrusive, friendly enough for waves and occasional casseroles, close enough in a crisis, careful about the distance in between. Bea had her routines, and they had theirs. She tended her garden in the warmer months, a modest rectangle of raised beds along the south side of the house, mostly herbs, some tomatoes, a stubborn rose bush that had survived things she would not have bet on. She walked to the library on Thursday afternoons. She went to the early service on Sundays at the Methodist Church on Maple Avenue, not out of devout certainty so much as out of a long habit of hoping, and because she liked the particular quality of the morning light through those old amber windows. She was not lonely in the way people assumed widows must be. She missed Sam, missed him the way you miss a part of your own body, a constant low awareness of absence, something you adjusted to but never stopped noticing. But she had made peace, over 6 years, with what her life actually was rather than mourning endlessly what it was not. She read, she gardened, she baked on Fridays, bread usually, or a simple cake, and left half of it on the porch for whoever needed it. She played cards on Tuesday evenings at the community center with a small group of women her age, and they talked about their grandchildren and the price of groceries, and occasionally carefully about dying, the way people do when they are old enough to look at it plainly. She had her 2 cups, and she had her days, and this was her life. Arthur Blythe moved into the house at the end of the street, the pale green one with the overgrown hedges, in October of that same year. He came quietly, a moving truck on a Tuesday, a handful of boxes, a single piece of furniture she could see from her front porch, a leather armchair, dark brown, the kind of chair that looks like it has heard many years of someone thinking in it. He was a tall man, slightly stooped now, at whatever age he was, she guessed early 70s, with white hair gone thin at the temples and large, careful hands. He moved the boxes himself, which struck her as both admirable and a little foolish. She brought him bread the next morning, plain white loaf, still warm. He came to the door in a flannel shirt, blue plaid, slightly wrinkled, and looked at the bread for a moment, as though he had forgotten that people did things like this. And then he said thank you in a way that suggested he meant it very much, but was out of practice saying it. "I'm Bea," she said, "Calloway, the yellow house, halfway up the street." "Arthur," he said, "Blythe." He offered his hand. His handshake was firm and brief. "I've been trying to find a grocery store within walking distance. I don't drive anymore." "There's a Harmon's about 6 blocks east," she said. "I walk there Wednesdays. You're welcome to come along if it would help." He looked at her again with that same expression, a little surprised, a little moved, recalibrating something. "That would help," he said. "Thank you." And that was how it started. They walked to Harmon's on Wednesday mornings. Arthur was a deliberate shopper. He read labels, he compared prices, he took his time in the produce section in the way of someone who cooked real meals rather than assembling them from packages. He had been, Bea learned gradually, a high school history teacher for 30 years in a town outside of Columbus, Ohio, before he retired and followed his wife, Carol, back to her hometown here. Carol had died 2 years ago, in the spring. He had stayed on because he didn't know where else to go, and because she had loved the town, and being where she had loved something felt, for now, like enough. They did not talk about their losses on those early walks, not directly. They talked about the town, what it had been, what it was becoming, whether the new coffee shop on 3rd Street would last. They talked about books carefully, testing what they had in common. They talked about the weather with the genuine interest of people who spent enough time outdoors for weather to matter. And underneath all of it, in the particular way of two people who have both survived enormous things and learned to carry those things with some dignity, they understood each other without needing to say so. By December, Arthur had begun stopping by on occasional mornings. Not every morning, not regularly, but now and then, when the week had been long or when he had something he'd been meaning to ask her. He would knock at the back door, the kitchen door, which is the door that matters in a house where someone has lived a long time. Bea would say, "Come in," and he would, and she would put the kettle on, and they would sit at the kitchen table and talk. He noticed the 2 cups the second or third time he came. She had been up early and had already finished her tea when he knocked, but both cups were still on the table. Hers, with a small ring on the wood where the heat had seeped through, and Sam's, rinsed and upside down on the rack. He didn't say anything. He looked at the rack, at the cup, at the table where the second chair still sat exactly across from hers, and he said nothing and sat down in the chair nearest the door. Not Sam's chair, she noticed. Some instinct had placed him on the correct side of that without being told. He was a man who paid attention. She had noticed this about him from the beginning. The careful way he listened, the way his eyes moved through a room, reading it. It was the teacher in him, she supposed, or perhaps just the particular quality of someone who has spent years living closely alongside another person and has retained the habit of noticing, even after that person is gone. He did not ask about the second cup that day, or the next time, or the time after that. He asked in February, on a morning when the snow was coming down in the particular heavy, muffled way that made the whole street go quiet, and Bea had put 2 cups on the table before he arrived and left them there. She was not sure why. She might have simply forgotten to clear Sam's before he knocked, and he had sat down across from her, not in Sam's chair, but near it, and for a while they had both watched the snow. "Is that his?" he asked finally. He nodded very slightly toward Sam's cup. Bea looked at it. She felt the familiar thing in her chest. Not quite pain, not quite peace, the particular sensation of holding something that is both. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He did not ask anything else. They sat with the snow for a while. Then he said, "Carol used to make biscuits on Sundays. I still buy the ingredients every week. I've never made them without her." Bea looked at him. "I just buy them," he said, "flour and buttermilk, and then I put them in the cupboard." She understood exactly what he meant. "It's a way of keeping the Sunday," she said. "Yes," he said, "I suppose it is." They drank their tea. Outside, the snow kept falling. It would be easy to say that this was when things changed between them, but that is not quite how it happens when people are old enough to know better than to rush. What happened was quieter than a change. What happened was that something began to settle, the way good soil settles after rain, making room for what might grow there without forcing anything. If this story is staying with you, a quiet light helps me keep the lamp lit for others. Spring came to Clover Street the way it always did, a little too slowly and then all at once. The red maple in Bea's front yard leafed out in the second week of April, and she planted the herb bed on a Saturday afternoon while Arthur came and went, carrying soil from the garage to the beds, saying little and being useful in the practical, unhurried way she had come to appreciate about him. He didn't offer advice about the planting. He just carried what needed carrying. Louise came for a long weekend in May and sat in the kitchen watching Arthur help her mother hang a curtain rod in the back bedroom, and afterwards she said very carefully, "He seems like a good man, Mom." He is, Bee said. He's a lonely man who is trying not to be, same as me. Louise looked at her mother for a long moment. Is that what you are? Lonely? Bee thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything now. Sometimes, she said, but not in the way I used to be. In those first years after your father, there was a kind of loneliness that had edges to it, sharp ones. She paused. This is different. This is more like, she looked out the window, like a house that's mostly warm but has one room that stays a little cold. You know the room is there. You've made your peace with it. Louise nodded slowly. And Arthur? Bee smiled, a small, clear smile, the kind that is not performing anything for anyone. Arthur is a friend, she said. He is becoming a real friend. At my age, that is not a small thing. It was not a small thing. The summer moved through Clover Street with its particular American unhurriedness. Lawnmowers on Saturday mornings, the smell of someone's grill in the evenings, fireflies in the yard after dark. Bee and Arthur established, without ever explicitly establishing it, a rhythm. Wednesday grocery walks, occasional Thursday evenings on the porch when the weather was good, him in the wooden chair she'd brought from inside, her in the rocker her father had made. He told her about history, real history, the kind teachers know, full of the small human details that get left out of books. She told him about the town as she had known it across 40 years, which was its own kind of history. He told her about Carol. Bee told him about Sam. Not all at once, not like a flood, but slowly, the way people share things when they trust each other. A story here, a detail there, a particular memory offered and received with care. Sam's laugh, Carol's handwriting, which had been, Arthur said, astonishingly small and precise, the way Sam used to hum while he drove, unaware he was doing it, the way Carol had read the newspaper front to back every morning before she would speak to anyone, a requirement she'd made clear from the beginning of their marriage and that Arthur had honored for 31 years. She called it her decompression, Arthur said. She'd spent 20 years as an ER nurse. She said reading the newspaper was the only thing that made the news feel like it was happening somewhere manageable. Bee laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. That is the most sensible thing I have ever heard. Arthur smiled. He had a smile that came slowly and meant something when it arrived. They were careful with each other. This was not timidity. Neither of them was timid. People who have survived what they had survived tend to develop a clearer sense of what they are and are not afraid of. It was more like the carefulness of people who understand the value of what they are handling. Grief is not nothing. Memory is not nothing. The years behind you are not nothing. You do not pick these things up and put them down carelessly. Bee kept her 2 cups. Every morning, without fail, the ritual continued. Kettle on, 2 mugs, 2 tea bags, 2 cups poured. She would sit across from Sam's cup, not speaking to it, not performing anything, just letting the warmth of it occupy that side of the table while she occupied hers. It was the simplest thing and also somehow the most important. It was how she kept the morning honest. It was how she kept faith with something she did not want to let go of, and she did not think she should have to let go of it. She was old enough and sure enough of herself not to apologize for that. The second cup was not about being stuck. She knew people might see it that way. Ruth had worried about it gently in that first year. A grief counselor she'd seen briefly in the second year had asked whether she felt the ritual might be keeping her from moving forward, and Bee had thought about this seriously before answering. No. Moving forward did not mean erasing. It did not mean clearing the table. Moving forward meant carrying what was true and finding room for new true things alongside it. The cup was on the table. She was also walking to the grocery store on Wednesdays with a tall widower in a blue plaid shirt. Both things were true. The table was large enough for both. In August, Arthur's son Daniel came to visit from Portland. He was a quiet man in his mid-40s, bearded, a little watchful. He came for a week, and on the second day he knocked on Bee's door to return a pie dish she'd sent over, and stayed for half an hour talking about the town. At the door, leaving, he said, "I want you to know, whatever this is, whatever you and my father—" He stopped, started again. "He calls me on Sunday nights and he sounds different than he used to, less far away. I don't know how else to put it." He looked at her with Sam's kind of directness, the kind that means no harm, only honesty. "Thank you for that." Bee looked at him for a moment. "He's done the same for me," she said. "Tell him I said that, if you want." Daniel smiled. "I think you should tell him yourself." She did. That Sunday evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the light go amber and long across the lawn, she said, "Your son told me you sound less far away when you call him." Arthur was quiet for a moment, looking at the yard. "He's right," he said. "I do feel less far away." He paused. "Do you know what changed? I think it was having somewhere to walk to in the morning, somewhere that expected me." The word landed in the air between them, simple and true. Expected, not needed, not depended upon, just expected. The low, ordinary grace of having somewhere that knew you were coming. Bee looked at the fireflies beginning to come up from the grass. "Sam used to say that's what he loved about coming home," she said. "Not that I needed him to come home, that I expected him. He said it was the difference between being wanted and being necessary." She smiled at the memory, the particular texture of it. "He said being necessary was better." "He was right," Arthur said. The summer gave way to September, and September, with its smell of wood smoke and dry leaves, felt like a turning. Nothing dramatic, just a sense that something was different than it had been a year ago. That the shape of things had shifted slightly, making room for a new arrangement. It was a Tuesday in late September. Bee had woken early, earlier than usual, with that particular quality of wakefulness that comes sometimes in older years. Complete and sudden, like a light switched on. The maple outside had gone red overnight, it seemed. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at it for a long time before she filled the kettle. She set out the 2 cups. She put in 2 tea bags. She let them steep. She sat down. She looked at Sam's cup across the table, and she let herself, as she did every morning, feel the full weight of missing him. Not managed grief, not grief at a safe distance. The real thing, the warm and aching realness of it. 6 years, and she could still feel the exact shape of what was absent. She thought this was right. She thought you should be able to feel the shape of what you had lost for as long as you lived without that being called a problem. She sat with his cup for a while, and then this morning, something moved in her. Not away from the cup, not away from Sam, toward something, a shift as small and significant as a window being raised in a closed room. She thought of Arthur, alone at the end of the street in the pale green house, making himself a single cup of tea in a kitchen that was still mostly unfamiliar. She thought of him sitting at his table. She had seen it once. Dark wood, too large for one person, with a book open in front of him and that armchair visible through the doorway, and the particular silence of a house that has not had enough noise in it for long enough. She sat there a little longer. She finished her tea. Sam's cup sat full and warm and present, as it always was. The morning light came through the window and lay across the table the way it had for 39 years, the same light, the same angle, falling differently now because so much had changed, but falling still. She got up. She put on her coat. She picked up Sam's cup, still full, still warm. She stood at the counter with it. For a long time, she stood there, and then she poured it gently down the drain, the way she did every morning, rinsed it, set it on the rack. She took a different cup from the cabinet, a blue one with a wide brim, one she'd had for years and used sometimes for guests. She set the kettle back on and let it come to heat again. She made a fresh cup. She put on her coat and picked up the blue cup and walked out the back door and down the street in the cool September morning, the maple leaves skittering around her feet, to the pale green house at the end of Clover Street. She knocked at the back door. Arthur came to the door in his flannel shirt, a book in his hand, and he looked at the cup she was holding and then at her face. "I thought," she said simply, "that you might want some tea." He looked at her for a moment with that slow, meaning something smile. Then he opened the door wider and stepped back, and she came inside, into the warmth, into the particular quiet of his kitchen, with its dark table and its stacks of history books, and the armchair visible through the doorway. She set the blue cup on the table in front of the chair that would be his. He put the kettle on for her cup. They sat across from each other in the morning light, and outside the maple leaves were going on with the serious, unhurried business of turning, and the town was waking up around them, and the tea was warm. This was not a replacement. She wanted to be clear about that, at least inside herself, where she was always honest. Sam's cup was at home, on the rack, rinsed and real. The morning ritual would continue. Both cups on the table, the steeping, the sitting with. That was not ending. She would not end it. It was hers and Sam's, and it would remain hers and Sam's for as long as she breathed and chose and got up in the morning. But this cup, this blue-rimmed cup, this Tuesday morning on Clover Street, this was also hers. The table was large enough. Arthur wrapped his large, careful hands around the cup she had brought him. He didn't say thank you, not immediately. He just held the cup, and she understood that he understood. Then, "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "There's a lecture series at the library. History, Civil War letters, primary sources, Thursday evenings. I thought," he paused, "I thought you might find it interesting." "I might," she said. Would you come?" She looked at him across the table, this good, careful man who bought flour every week and didn't make the biscuits and called his son on Sunday nights and was slowly becoming less far away. "Yes," she said, "I'll come." They sat in the morning for a while longer. There was nothing that needed to be solved or decided. The light moved slowly across the table the way light does when you are not hurrying it. 2 cups of tea, 2 people at a table on the quiet end of long lives, finding out what there might still be to find. Outside, a car went by on Clover Street. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The maple kept doing its October work. The ordinary world proceeded gently around them, the way it always has, indifferent to grief, indifferent to love, and somehow the perfect background for both. Later, walking home in the middle of the morning, Bea felt something she had almost forgotten the name for. Not happiness exactly. She was suspicious of exactly, at her age, something more honest than happiness. Fullness, maybe. The particular satisfaction of a morning that had been exactly what a morning could be. She went in through the kitchen door. The blue sunflower apron was on its hook. Sam's mug was on the rack. The red maple was blazing in the front yard, and the light in the kitchen was the color of everything she had ever loved about autumn. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment. Then she made herself a fresh cup of tea and sat down at the table. Her side, her chair, the chair closest to the stove. And she put her hands around the cup and looked across at where Sam's cup sat on the rack, clean and present. "Still here," she said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, or maybe to everyone. The morning went on around her. The maple gave its red light. The kettle ticked as it cooled. The house was warm and quiet and full, not empty, not ever quite empty. And the second cup was on the rack, and Bee was at the table, and this was her life. And it was still, against all odds, against all the subtractions of the years, a life worth the mourning. There is something in us that resists the idea that love, once formed, has to be dismantled when the person who called it into being is gone. We are told, in various ways, that we must let go. And perhaps some things do need releasing, the sharpest edges of grief, the weight that bends us in direction we cannot sustain. But the love itself, the morning ritual, the second cup, some lights, once lit, are meant to stay burning. Bee kept hers burning. She lit a new one too. She found that there was room, that there had always been room for both. This is perhaps the most radical thing that Quiet Story asks us to consider, that love does not diminish by expanding, that keeping faith with the dead and making room for the living are not opposites, that a table, if it is the right table, and if the person sitting at it has a big enough heart, can hold both. This is what Clover Street knew that October. This is what the maple knew, going red in the front yard while two old people drank their tea. This is what a plain white cup with a blue stripe around the rim knew, rinsed and resting on the rack, while a blue-rimmed cup made its quiet way down the street. This is what the morning knew, as it always does, as it always has, that someone is still at the table, that the light is still on, that there is still time. Thank you for spending this hour with me. If you'd like more stories like this one, subscribe, and I'll leave the light on for you next time. Rest well.